Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. I'm not easily impressed. I have eclectic taste which changes frequently, and as a result, I often don't know what I like. So it's not every day that I find a book compelling. But here's one that very definitely is. It's called Born a Muslim, Some Truths About Islam in India. And it raises a critical question that's been waiting to be asked for a very long time. What is it like to be a Muslim in India? And I warn you, the answer is not just honest, it's frequently distressing. But there are other reasons why I would recommend this book as well. It's partly autobiographical, it's often anecdotal, it's frequently analytical, and it's full of interesting research and illuminating history. And that means it's a jolly good read. And its author, Ghazala Wahab, is my guest today. Ghazala Wahab, your book starts with a dramatic but even hair-raising account of a riot in Agra in the wake of L.K. Advani's Rath Yatra of 1990 when a mob attacked your home. At the time you were barely 19. I read that account, riveted but horrified. Why don't you start by telling the audience what happened?
This happened in November 1990, and before the actual attack happened, our neighbors were coming in for warning my father. They anticipated something like this would happen. So on the day of the attack, there was kind of inevitability to it because there were a lot of people coming and telling my father that shift your family out, shift your family out. Eventually, my father booked us in Mughal Hotel, where my mother drove us to the hotel. And in the afternoon, because there was so much happening, she got nervous, she came back home. And then everybody, we kind of knew that something is happening today. It's the day which everybody was worried about. And sure enough, just after the late evening prayer, which is Maghrib, it was like a twilight kind of a time. And we heard a huge noise from outside, people shouting slogans. So my brother and I, we ran to the door. And in our house, we had a glass panel next to the main door, which kind of overlooked the porch and the gate and the road beyond. We were watching that, and then we came back in, and my father handed me a diary with phone numbers of all the police officers and district authority people he knew in Agra. He said, just keep calling them and tell them that our house is going to be under attack. I tried repeatedly, but nobody picked up the calls. None of my calls were answered. Then we went back to the gate because it was so exciting. And so my younger brother and I, we went back to the glass panel, and we were watching the crowd. Then the crowd stopped at our gate. They were carrying these fire torches, and they had, we didn't realize they had stones in their hands. And right at the head of the mob, we recognized one of our neighborhood boys. And his younger brother used to be my brother's playmate. So we ran inside and said, oh, this boy, this Sanjay Bhaiya is right there. And my father said, oh, then we don't have to worry because obviously he'll mollify the mob and they'll just shout some slogans.
But that didn't happen.
No, they started throwing stones. And at that point, obviously, all of us were very, very frightened. And my younger uncle, who used to stay with us, he went to my parents' room. He took out my father's licensed revolver and he just dashed the flight of stairs up. He wanted to go to that rooftop and fire some shots in the air to frighten the mob. But thankfully, my father had better sense and he screamed after him, and my mother ran after him to hold him back.
But did the mob damage the house?
The windows were broken. Our car, which was parked in the porch, that was completely destroyed.
So they entered the gate and came to the porch?
No, they did not enter the gate, but there wasn't much of a distance between the porch and the house.
And the car was damaged?
And the car was right outside. So
and the windows were damaged?
The windows were damaged, the first floor windows were damaged, our sitting area, all the windows, because they had huge rocks. And
the family was cowering in fear all the while?
Absolutely, and I kept trying the phone numbers because my father was screaming and my mother was screaming.
And no one came to help you?
No, and no calls were answered.
No policeman at all?
No.
How long did this stoning last?
Probably 15-20 minutes.
15-20 minutes of sheer hell?
But, it looks 15-20 minutes doesn't sound much now. But at that point, you have no clue what the mob can do.
But absolutely no one responded. You rang all the police people you knew, but no one came?
Nobody.
So you were on your own, at the mercy of the mob.
Mob.
This dreadful experience turned into a terrible personal predicament for your father. 7 years earlier, he had moved from the family home in a Muslim majority area of Agra, and as you write, immersed himself in the social, cultural, and economic life of Agra, hobnobbing with the who's who of the city. And yet, when it came to a communal division, the family was on its own. He was seen as a Muslim. And as you write, forever a suspect, forever a scapegoat. This must have been terrible for your father.
Absolutely. In a small town, the district authorities, the district magistrates, DIG, these are the lords of the city. So hobnobbing with them is not just a matter of prestige for people of the that small town, but also kind of a insurance. You know that you can bank on them if you need something or the other. So this was a betrayal of this belief that we can bank on them because we know them so well socially. They come to our house, they attend our parties, we go to their parties, and so this bonhomie was shattered. This illusion was shattered.
Not only was your father let down by people he considered friends, but more importantly, his belief that he had immersed himself in the mainstream. He'd moved from the family home, he'd moved from a Muslim majority area to live with Hindus. That belief that he was part of the mainstream was also rebuffed and rejected.
Yes. And the consequence of that was that my father, I suppose, has not been able to overcome that even today. Now when all this is happening all around us, he sometimes says that he's very fearful of me because of the kind of work I do, and he keeps saying that you have to be cautious. After all, it is their country. And I get very offended. Why do you say that? But
that's a very interesting thing. A man who immersed himself in the mainstream, broke with the family in that sense, now today calls it their country. Meaning Hinduon ka mulk hai.
Yes. So this is the most distressing thing which has happened over the years.
This riot, this mob attack, actually shattered your father's self-confidence.
Yes. Not his own confidence, but his confidence in the people that he thought had accepted him or accepted people like him.
You know, the most amazing thing, and as you write, no case was recorded, no charges were filed. It was as if the incident never happened. There was no question of bringing people to justice. There was no question of the guilty being brought to.
In India, I think there is a problem. There is a systemic problem of holding the law enforcement agencies to account. Whether it's the police or you see even the armed forces, the whole AFSPA is geared towards not holding them accountable because the government is told repeatedly that it will affect their morale.
Except that in this instance, your father knew the DIG, he knew the police, he'd been
Yes.
to their parties, they'd been to his, as you said.
Yes.
And even then, not only did they not come to his defense when the attack was happening, but even afterwards, they did nothing to catch the culprits to bring the guilty to book.
No, the fact that we survived was their paying of debt, I suppose, that no serious harm came to you.
As your mother explained to you later on, she said what pained your father was the humiliation. And I suppose this is why you write, we collectively worked towards erasing the memory of those days from our lives. The family's literally drawn a curtain over it.
Yes. So much so that, when you're trying to remember things, sometimes your imagination plays tricks on you. So when I was writing this, I was recalling a lot of things and I just wanted to check a few details with my mother. So I called her up, and when I was talking to her, she said, "Why are you asking these things? Why out of the blue after all these years?" I said, "I am just writing something. I had not mentioned that I'm going to write this in the book." So she was very, very worried, and then she told my father, and my father spoke to me, and he said, "Are you writing about it?" I said, "No, I'm not writing right now." Then finally, when I sent him the copy, this is the part he's most unhappy about.
Absolutely, because this is something he wants to forget. This
Yes.
is something that so shook him and his belief in India that he wishes it had never happened. And yet, it is a sad, inescapable truth.
Yes. He told me, and he said that this is not a matter of public interest. Who would be interested in reading this? Why have you put this in the book?
The truth is that this dreadful experience on that terrible day had a huge impact on a non-Muslim reader like me. And yet I imagine that for tens and millions, maybe hundreds of millions of Muslims, this is not an unusual experience. They live every day of their lives with this fear and apprehension at the back of their mind.
More now in the last few years, probably last 2 decades, but before that, I think this was not really, this fear was not there. And I'll tell you the reason, though we have had a history of communal violence in India since partition onwards, but they used to happen in one place at a time and then another place. So people would get over it and move on. But
in the 90s, this changed.
The 90s and this whole Babri agitation and movement and subsequent demolition and the kind of society that we have emerged as, this has changed that.
So what was a one-time dreadful experience for your parents is now a living fear that haunts tens if not hundreds of millions of Muslims all the time. They live with this fear, Khuda jaane mujh pe log kab piche pad jayenge.
My carpenter told me that, and I liked the turn of phrase, he said, कोई वजह नहीं होती है, सिर्फ बहाना चाहिए
मुसलमानों को मारने के लिए,
दंगा होने के लिए. And danga is actually a misnomer. There is no really, there have been probably very few riots. Most of the time, it's one-sided violence.
मगर अगर सिर्फ बहाना चाहिए और दंगे की भी ज़रूरत नहीं, then it means that Muslims live with the fear that they could be attacked at any time. They're constantly looking over their shoulder, worrying, wondering, is it going to happen?
A certain section of Muslims, and I think here it's uncomfortable to talk about this, primarily because we believe that Muslims are a classless society. But the most vulnerable part are the people who are from the lower class, which is like the working class, the carpenters, the painters, the farmers, the laborers.
These are also people with least contact, least influence, and least able to defend and protect themselves.
Absolutely. And
so the more poor you are and the more unprotected you are, the more vulnerable and the more scared.
Absolutely.
Let's at this point broaden our discussion. You say in your introduction, and I'm quoting you, when I started to write this book, I wanted to address fellow Muslims and tell them that they needed to look beyond the mullahs and embrace modernity. But the more you researched and found out just how vulnerable Muslims in India are and how extremely fearful they are, a different issue presented itself to you. You say, how does one tell people just struggling to stay alive that they need to change their thinking, their manner of living, their approach to religion? Would I be right in saying that in a very real sense, that is the predicament of Muslims in India? And secondly, that in a very real sense is the challenge your book addresses.
That's correct. When I started the book, I had started from when I started to conceptualize the book, I started from a position of privilege. I had forgotten about this incident in the sense that it was not top of mind memory for me any longer. And I was looking at myself, I was looking at my education background, my job, and the society I was moving in. And I used to think that why can't more Muslims be like this? Why do they have to constantly refer to mullahs and clergy and keep seeking fatwas for smallest things? But once the research started and I also started thinking about my own growing up years and the background that I came from, and I realized that actually I have a very top-down view of the Muslim community despite being a Muslim. So that was not a correct approach. And that is when I started diversifying my research and I started reading up a lot of material and a lot of post-partition literature.
The interesting thing is the research for writing this book made you understand the truth of the Muslim community, particularly the most poor, the most vulnerable.
Absolutely.
And this is where you said to yourself, how do you tell people to change their thinking, their manner of living, their approach to religion, when they're just struggling to stay alive?
I used to be judgmental about places like Okhla, And I used to think, why do they live like this? But the point is, they have no choice. This is something I had not imagined in living in my cocoon or wherever what I was doing. So this was a bit of a shocker that actually the worst thing that has afflicted the Muslims today in India is lack of choice. They, whether it's education, employment, or accommodation, they do not, even if they have the resources, they do not have the luxury of choosing what they want.
In fact, you're particularly telling in your book when you describe what you call the condition of Muslims today. You say, and I'm quoting you, that they're caught in a pincer grip that has two prongs. The external prong is what you call the discrimination they face at the hands of lawmaking and law enforcing agencies. Describe what that does to them.
See, the biggest impact it has is psychological. Because if you are constantly living with this pervasive insecurity, it's not just insecurity about life, it is insecurity about whether you will be framed wrongly in a case of terrorism, or whether suddenly your livelihood would be affected because the government policy has changed overnight without factoring in your employment options or possibilities. See, if you, I have mentioned about this in the book, both Professor Amitabh Kundu, who conducted the post-Sachar evaluation committee, as well as Justice Sachar, they both mentioned that majority of Muslims in India are self-employed. Now, within this self-employment, a large number is employed in what we call cattle trade, whether it's trade in cattle because of meat or it's because of leather. That is where a large number of North Indian Muslims are employed, whether downstream industries of leather processing, skin processing, or stuff like that, or shoe manufacturing, as my family was in or is still in, or meat industry.
And so when Yogi Adityanath launches his campaign against cattle skin, cattle trading, these Muslims become the most vulnerable and they become fearful.
They become unemployed. So that's a direct assault on their employment. They have very few options of getting into organized mainstream employment sector.
But you make one further point as well. You say because they are discriminated against by lawmaking and law enforcing agencies, it forces them to seek security in their own numbers. And that means they're forced to live in ghettos, they're forced to live at the periphery of the mainstream. In other words, this behavior by law enforcing agencies pushes Muslims further and further to the periphery.
Absolutely. But even this periphery does not give them security. If you see what happens in places like Juhupara in Ahmedabad or in Mumbara, if the law agency are pushed by their superiors to prevent a scapegoat or a suspect, it's like they have already made stock there. So they just go pick up some boy and present him as a terrorist.
Absolutely. Muslims become easy to pick because no one wants to defend them.
Yes.
But there's another consequence, you say, of living in ghettos. They live in ghettos because that's where they get security. Their security comes from the fact that only they can protect themselves. But the consequence is they have no choice in terms of accommodation, no choice in terms of education, no choice in terms of profession. These essentials are very limited for them.
Absolutely.
And this means also, you say, that equal opportunity and justice becomes just concepts for them, not a reality.
They're not even issues which they would consider, because their primary focus is always on some sort of a skill development, some kind of employment, so they can feed themselves and their families.
The second prong of this pincer, you say, is an internal one. It consists of illiteracy, poverty, and what you boldly call the disproportionate influence of mullahs. What impact does this have on Muslims?
See, anybody who's insecure, irrespective of religion, tends to turn towards religion, because religion kind of gives you that succor, it gives you that assurance that, okay, things can get better. So Muslims have, because of this history, post-partition history in India, and the profile of their community now, because all the majority of educated Muslims or upwardly mobile Muslims had shifted to Pakistan. So this profile ensured that they were more and more veering towards the religious leadership, the clergy, for advice, for counseling, and also for assurance that Allah will take care of you.
So mullahs and the clergy ended up having a dominant influence on them.
Absolutely.
But you say one other thing. It also means that they remain uneducated, and because they remain uneducated, they remain unemployed.
The education part is a very, very serious challenge. Because of the lack of choice in accommodation, they all kind of huddle together in a ghetto. Now, a ghetto doesn't have good schools, because a school is not just a building, it's also the faculty where you get good teachers. If the community per se is not well educated, it cannot produce good quality of teachers. Even if it musters some teachers, unless they know what kind of education, the modern education, what are the courses which the kids should do for employment, this education is pointless.
And furthermore, if Muslims can't get educated, they can't get employed in
They
valuable,
cannot. So it's a vicious
good jobs.
circle. It's a very, very terrible vicious circle.
And that reinforces the influence and hold of the mullahs.
Exactly.
So in other words, as you say, pincer grip is a wonderful allegory. They're caught and they're being squeezed from both ends. The imagery is just perfect. Let's come to what this means for younger Muslims. Every single one of them born Indian, and every one of them entitled to the same rights as every other Indian. And yet you say young Muslim men are frequently picked up and held without charge indefinitely under some anti-terrorist law or another. And research shows that mobility for young Muslims is considerably worse than scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And I know this sounds politically incorrect, but your audience usually thinks that Dalits and tribals have the worst upward mobility. You're saying the upward mobility of Muslims is even worse.
I'm not saying this. The research has shown this, and I have quoted the research which I have access to. The truth is, Dalits, because there have been so much of focus on, and rightly so, so a lot of proactive and lot of ameliorative measures were taken for their upliftment. They were also able to consolidate themselves as a political force. Muslims have the reputation of being a vote bank, but actually it's irrelevant vote bank, nobody cares.
This is the truth. No one cares about the upward mobility of Muslim boys. And worse still, Muslim boys are easily picked upon when the police want someone they can pin the blame on.
Absolutely.
So they're literally picked off the roadside and charged with terror, even though they may be completely innocent and even unaware of what they're supposed to have done.
There's so many such cases, and a few of them have actually written books on their experiences when they were honorably acquitted by the Supreme Court after 20 years of spending.
But I take
life.
it many are not acquitted and spend their lives in detention, under trial, being punished for something they never did.
No.
This is why so many Muslim mothers you spoke to said they wanted their sons to go abroad to leave India. In fact, one of the mothers said this: a Muslim boy in India will either be a wastrel or viewed as a rioter and be killed by the police. It's horrifying to believe that mothers can see their son's future in these dim, dark ways, but that is a reality Muslim mothers accept.
This is, I don't think, as widespread as it appears. A lot of Muslim men or women who go abroad, they really do not have the choice of going and settling down there. A large number of them, they go to the Gulf, they work there, send their remittances back home, and eventually, when they do not hold that job any longer, they come back to India. So this mobility, it's aspirational, but actually in
It's
truth,
short term.
it's not there. No, it's not even there, because these people who are going to the Gulf, they're skilled laborers, they're blue collar workers. So
But the horrifying thing is that a mother should believe that her son's future is either he will be a wastrel or he will be viewed as a rioter and killed by the police. Mothers don't see their sons' futures in those dark terms, and yet some Muslim mothers believe this is the only future for their sons in India.
Absolutely. And again, this is very class and society specific, in region specific. I suppose this will not be true of
Oh, sure,
people
without doubt. Your mother wouldn't see your future in these terms, or your brother's future in these terms, but poor Muslims, the majority, have no option.
Geography also plays a role in this. People in southern part of India, the Muslims there, their levels of insecurity are nothing compared to those in the northern parts of India.
It's much worse in the north.
Absolutely.
In fact, what's even more distressing is that those who are too poor to escape, and I use that word escape deliberately, because for them it is an escape from India, sometimes end up changing their names to change their identity. You've come across some who pretend to be Hindus in the hope that this will protect them.
It was a revelation to me. I had never encountered this while growing up. This is, I think, a big city phenomena, because the insecurities are bigger in a big city. It's something like Muslims not finding accommodation in Delhi or Bombay.
But the horrifying thing is that you have met one or two
No,
young
I've
men.
met a lot of them.
A lot of them?
A lot of them. I've quoted a few, but I've met a lot of them, and I was surprised that I never knew something like this was happening.
A lot of young Muslim men pretend to be Hindu to protect themselves, because if you allow the world to know you have a Muslim name, you're in danger of your life.
Well, no, probably not all the time, but you are in danger of not getting work. If you want work, if you want employment, then the only way they think they can get employment is if they kind of hide their Muslim identity.
This is truly horrifying.
Yes.
That you have to change your identity, you have to pretend to be Hindu, otherwise you won't get work, you won't get fair treatment.
Yes.
And the amazing thing is, this is something, until I read about it in your book, had never even occurred to me. I'd never thought of it. And I'm sure that's true of the vast majority of our country. And yet the paradox is, we're unaware of what we're doing to Muslims, but we continue to call them and treat them as anti-nationals and to claim that they're appeased by politicians. The world outside the Muslim community doesn't really understand the torment they're going through.
That is true. And I think the main reason for that is lack of education and knowledge of the outside world. They take prejudice and they take propaganda as truth, because all they have done is just allow their minds and their senses to be dumped by propaganda, by vested interests.
And this is the real paradox. We call them anti-nationals, we say Muslims are appeased, and yet the truth is, there are many young Muslims pretending to be Hindus because otherwise they can't get a job, because otherwise they won't get fair treatment. Yes. So far from being appeased, far from being anti-nationals, we're denying them a fair, just life.
This is an observation which Sachar committee also made.
But this is what your book brings home. And forget Sachar committee, that's dried, almost desiccated research. Here, it comes alive because people talk to you. How shaken were you when you discovered, and your words were, there are a lot of such people. How much did it shake you?
No, it was terrible, because I had not imagined, and I was then thinking that all the people that I meet, do I need to also ask them, are you a Muslim by any chance? Because they give their names in a particular way, whether they're vegetable vendors who come in these gated communities. So it's very, very distressing to know that we have come to this stage in life where a civilized society also doesn't give a chance of dignified existence to other people.
How much of a surprise would this come to middle-class educated Muslims like yourself? Are they aware that poor Muslims have to often pretend to be Hindu just to be able to survive?
A lot of Muslims know. In fact,
a lot know.
They know. A lot of Muslims, I have quoted in my book, they have mentioned this to me about their own street vendors, about their own vegetable vendor who comes there, or carpenter who comes there.
So this is something middle-class and rich Muslims know about, but haven't done very much about and haven't written about. You're the first to expose it.
That is the most unfortunate part. Even in the course of research of this book, a lot of Muslims, when I told them that I'll be quoting them, they did not want to be part of a book like this. They told me, "Why are you writing about Muslims? You know, it's waste of time. You
You'll
talk
bring
about
the
Dalits."
wrath of Hindus on us, don't do it.
No, and they said, "Talk about Dalits."
In other words, what Muslims are saying to you, leave us in the shadow, leave us in the dark, at least we are safe.
Yeah.
Shine the light on us, and who knows what repercussions we may face.
Yes.
This is harrowing, completely harrowing. But there is another aspect to what I call the Muslim story. In a sense, it's the flip side. And you write about it in your book equally forthrightly. It's the predicament of moderate Muslims. You say, on the one hand, conservative or devout Muslims disparage them. On the other hand, Hindus suspect them. So these moderate Muslims are not just caught between two worlds, they're actually torn between two worlds.
See, moderation is a lifestyle, it's not an ideology. So when you are faced with somebody who's driven by ideology, you always are defensive. You are just trying to explain, okay, why I don't say the namaz regularly. So you are your own fellow people, they view you as slothful, lazy, or dodgy as far as your faith is concerned. But when you are faced with a non-Hindu, they don't see you as a moderate, they just see you as a Muslim. And the worst thing is that because they are so filled with prejudice in their mind, they do not see you for what you are. In their mind, they are putting a stereotype of a Muslim which they have grown up with or which they have probably internalized on you, which is why a lot of Muslims hear things like, "Oh, but you don't look like a Muslim." That is because they believe their understanding of a Muslim is driven purely by the stereotype they have in their mind, which has no basis in reality.
So what you're saying is that Hindus look at moderate Muslims but still see conservative devout ones instead and won't recognize that this is a modern Muslim and a different Muslim. They see them with the prejudice that they have for devout Muslims. And in reverse, Muslims look upon moderate Muslims and see them as people who've broken away and have been disloyal and are unfaithful and have turned their back on the religion.
So they
get the worst of both worlds.
Absolutely. They think they are apologist Muslims or Sarkari Muslims, as somebody would say. That, they're just trying to...
You're clearly a moderate Muslim, a modern Muslim, and also quite clearly an advanced feminist Muslim. Do you get the worst of both worlds?
I do. And I do that from my family members also, extended family members.
So you're battling on two fronts all the time?
Yes.
How difficult is it for you?
Again, I am a bit privileged from a lot of other Muslims. So the people that I work with or I engage with most of the time, they are like me. They are, I would say, enlightened. They are educated in the real sense that they use their brains.
So they've learned to disguise their prejudice. But what you're suggesting is that it is almost impossible for poor Muslims to be moderate Muslims.
No, even middle class Muslims, because if you're living, it depends upon who are you interacting with. I know a lot of moderate middle class Muslims who pretend to be devout when they are in a certain group of people. Women cover their heads because they feel that they'll gel better. And when they are with their non-Muslim friends, then they wear certain kind of clothes so that they can mix with that sort of a group.
So moderate Muslims have to live two lives in a sense.
Yes.
They have to pretend to be two different people depending upon who they're with.
Who they're engaging with at that point.
We're coming to the end of this interview, Ghazala. I want to put to you two questions that in fact you have raised yourself in your book. The first is, what does it mean to be a Muslim in India? I know your whole book is about that. I know our whole discussion is about that. But give me a simple answer. What does it mean to be a Muslim in India?
In today's India, it's a balancing act that a Muslim is having to do. A Muslim has to worry about survival. He has or she has to worry about moving forward in life, which is upward mobility. as I have mentioned in the book, the upward mobility or intergenerational upward mobility is very, very poor in a Muslim. If your father was doing certain things in life, you are likely to only do that and not move forward. So this jump is very, very difficult for a Muslim. The other terrible thing that is happening today is that even qualified Muslims find it very difficult to get absorbed in mainstream organized work sector. So they have to, they most of the time are underemployed in jobs which are much, much below their education level or what their education would have told them they would achieve, or you know, there's a huge gap between their aspirations and what they manage to achieve.
So if life is a struggle, if you're a Muslim, the struggle is greater.
Yes, it's huge compared to anybody else in the country.
And the poorer you are, the less influential you are as a Muslim, the more difficult the struggle.
Yes, and it is compounded by the fact that you are not getting a fair treatment by the government, you're not getting the fair treatment by law makers or the law enforcement agencies, that you are always looked at with suspicion. So you have to work doubly hard to ensure that you do not attract any suspicion or any negative attention to yourselves.
How much worse has it become during the last 6 years under Modi?
It's become very bad. And the reason I say that is the fear of communal violence had always been there. But now there is so much of discord, a permanent state of fear that you don't know what can happen. Your education levels have diminished, your options have diminished, because the more you worry about your safety, lesser risk you're willing to take for either work or education. You do not want to send your girls out to study because you don't know what can happen to them. You're worried about your children, your boys going out to study because you don't know what can happen to them.
So Muslims are learning to curb their ambition, to curb their aspiration. They're lowering their horizons,
yes,
and limiting their opportunities. My last question, and again, it's one that you address in the book. Is it possible to be a Muslim, you ask, and be forward-looking?
There is no contradiction. Islam itself encourages education. In fact, this is one of the things which has been repeatedly written in the Quran and the later subsequent books of Hadith, that education is important, learning is important. Ironically, the basic literacy level of an average Muslim is at par with anybody else. It is only beyond the basic literacy level that the problems happen.
But this is where the hold of the Muslim mullah, this is where the repression of conservative society has to be broken.
There's another factor here. See, forward-looking is a luxury which you can have if you are comfortable in your present state, if you are confident and secure in your present state. If you're forever grappling with fear and insecurity and uncertainty about future, then your entire being is focused only on surviving. Yes.
This is what I described earlier when I quoted from your introduction, the predicament of Muslims in India. And as you said, this is the challenge you faced when you wrote your book. I have to tell you, from my point of view, you've succeeded in fulfilling that challenge admirably. The one thing your book brings home to every single reader is the terrible predicament of a society and people that want to break free, but either others won't let them, or their own mullahs won't let them, and worse still, the way they are viewed by others won't let them. Ghazala, I hope your book is very widely read, and I hope in particular the government sits down and reads it. Thank you very
so
much
much for having me.
Take care, stay safe.